two-part series, and we're really excited about it. And I think so are you. We've had over 450 people who have registered for the event. So I certainly think that we've hit a topic that is of great interest to people. Today, we're also joined by our facilitator, who's also our co-host, Jennifer Kelly. So welcome, Jennifer. We're delighted you can join us. So I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Before we begin, I would like to take this moment to recognize that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. We acknowledge with respect the histories, cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. And we would encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the lands where you are joining from today and the Indigenous people for whom those lands are traditional territory. The Office of the Alumni Engagement is passionate about creating opportunities for alumni to connect with Memorial, no matter where you are in the world. So Munalum 101 actually began during the early days of the pandemic and is now a cornerstone of our alumni programming. So whether you join us online or in person, we're here to keep you connected with each other and with Memorial. Beyond this event today, there's many ways to stay involved. It can be our different programming events like this, online offerings, and you can find all of the details of events that we have coming up on our website or reach out to a member of our team anytime. We also want to take this moment to thank Bel Air Direct, who is formerly Johnson Insurance. Bel Air Direct provides home and auto insurance at fantastic rates for Memorial alumni. And we would encourage you to if you want to take a moment, grab your phone. You can use a QR code and you can see what savings may be available to you. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we dive into the presentation, which is why I know you're all here. After Jennifer speaks, there is going to be a Q&A portion. So we would encourage people to ask their questions early on in the chat. So you will be able to find the chat. You should be able to see it on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. When you are putting in any comments, we would encourage you to send a message to everyone. And then that way it's not going to one moderator and one of us isn't able to see it. This session is also going to be recorded. And so after the event, you'll receive a link so that you're able to watch it. And so people know, we currently have over 230 people on this call. So when the Q&A portion does begin, we may not be able to answer every question, but we will certainly endeavor to try to do so. So I would now like to take this moment to introduce the fantastic Jennifer Kelly, who is our presenter and co-host. Jennifer has been a facilitator with Gardner Center for 7 years and teaches courses in cross-cultural communication, cultural safety, workplace communication, presentation skills, and more. She's also worked as a curriculum developer with many of the Gardner Center clients, which includes the government of Nunavut. She has a few degrees and qualifications, including a BA, a BEd, or Bachelor of Education from Memorial. And Jennifer is going to lead us today through the ins and outs of inclusive communication, which we know is an essential skill. So this would apply to both our professional and personal environments. So without further ado, Jennifer, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Allison, so much. And thank you to all of you for having me here today and joining our learning community. For those of you who have worked with Gardner Center before, welcome back. We truly appreciate your continued trust. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, whether you are new to Gardner Center or perhaps you're an alumnus of Memorial University, a very special welcome to you as we spend this time learning together. Before we begin, I do want to talk with you a little bit about Gardner Center, or to remind those of you who are familiar with Gardner Center about all we offer and bring to you. We are a leader in professional development and executive education within Memorial University's Faculty of Business Administration. We are dedicated to empowering organizations and people across all sectors, and we do that by providing practical and interactive courses and webinars like this today, designed to better equip you with the latest business strategies and insights. Overall, our programs foster dynamic learning environments where we get a chance to learn from each other and exchange diverse ideas, share learning experiences, and in turn, we can build valuable networks. Really, Gardner Center takes a lot of pride in events like we are doing today because we get to help you as an individual, and we get to help organizations adapt to today's evolving challenges in the workplace. And we have a proven track record of doing that because we are committed to your personal and professional growth. And that's just another reason why I'm so excited to be here with you today, representing Gardner Center and, of course, alumni and Memorial University. Before I begin sharing my presentation, I did want to talk a little bit about what to expect, just so that those of you who have raised your hand or are looking to ask a question, just so that you know what to expect. So this is a webinar format. And what that means is that I will be talking with you for about 40 minutes. And then at the end, as Allison mentioned, there'll be a question and answer segment where you can ask any questions that you may have. We will certainly do our best to get through them, as Allison talked about a moment ago. So like I said, I noticed some of you have raised your hand, etc. Unfortunately, we're going to be saving till the end for those questions and to hear your insights. That being said, the chat is open. The chat is open and available for you to record any insights that you have or to offer some thoughts. I will do my absolute best to check the chat and to read some of the commentary, but it is open for you. It just means that I may not be guaranteed to offer a response, but I will definitely do my best to hear and see you all. Know that I'm here with you, and that at the end we'll get that chance to talk one-on-one during the Q&A. So with that all being said, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And welcome to part one officially. I'd like to share with you the learning objectives, or the goals that we have for today during our time together. We're going to identify what culture is and how interconnected it is to our daily interactions and routines. We'll complete a cultural awareness exercise. So for that, you are going to need a notepad and a pen, or open up your notes app on your phone, or you can even open up Microsoft Word if you are joining us from your computer or laptop. So lots of options to record your responses to the cultural awareness exercise. And finally, we will identify the 5 principles of cultural safety. So I want to point out that this is part 1 of 3. The topic is all on intercultural and inclusive communication. So they are connected, but yet the sessions are also separate, that if you don't come back for the next one, of course, I certainly hope you do, but if you have to miss the next 2, you will still gain a lot of insight and knowledge just from the first webinar. Here is our outline for today, and it mirrors those learning objectives that I just discussed. We're going to look at culture, how we define culture, and the unexpected ways it shows up in our daily lives and environment. We're going to do that cultural awareness activity that I just mentioned. It's called the Iceberg Cultural Activity. That's its name. And for that, you're going to need your notepad or pen or a notes app open. And then we will talk about cultural safety. So, Graham, I see that you've raised your hand. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I won't be able to pause and answer any comments or questions now. If you are having a technical challenge, we do have some Gardner Center representatives right here on the call that can help you with any technical challenges. You just direct message them in the chat. I've shared with you what my purpose and intentions are, my learning goal. I'm really curious about yours. And I invite you now to share that in the chat. What made you register for this webinar today? What stood out to you as something that you really wanted to learn? So again, let us know in the chat what your learning goal is for today. What are you hoping to take away from our time together today? I'll give you a moment to reflect on that, and you do have the option to type your learning goal in the chat. And again, I just want to remind that I do see people with raised hands, but I will be unable to respond at this time. But the chat is open, and I would love to see your responses in the chat. I'm going to read as many as I can, and in the end, we have a Q&A where we get to talk a little bit then. I see some responses coming in. Looks like a lot of you are looking to gain better understanding of the terms. That's a great goal. Excellent that you're needing the needs. Yeah, there's a lot more of a priority now placed on inclusive communication. It's really important because our workplaces are becoming more and more diverse. A lot of you are interested in implementing this into your business practices, meeting your organizational needs, becoming more culturally aware. Amazing. Yeah, your goals are really reflective of what you're going to learn today. So remember that we won't cover every single topic today. This is just part 1 of 3. So I hope certainly you're going to come back. But everything in inclusive communication starts and begins with culture. So that's why today we're really going to focus in on culture and what it means and how it shows up in our daily interactions. Looks like a lot of you are also looking to be more inclusive communicators. That's amazing, and you're all here, and that's a first start towards that. So how can you communicate better in an increasingly diverse world? How can we move together in being respectful and more inclusive in our communication? Inclusive communication means that it's communication for everybody. And the skills and practices that we will discuss and that I'll share with you and that we'll share with each other over the next 3 sessions can really be widely used in any of your communication interactions. But like when we're building any new skill, we need to start with awareness. So before we can begin to even learn a new skill and then begin practicing it and applying it in our daily lives and workplaces, we need to gain awareness first. So that's where we start in our 3 series. We start with awareness. I want to talk with you about culture. I'll give you a moment to read what's on the slide, and then I'm going to speak verbally to what culture is. So culture refers to the shared beliefs, values, and knowledge that is held by a particular group of people. It can consist of language, religion, even particular foods or cuisine, arts, traditions, and social norms. So again, culture refers to the shared sense of beliefs, values, and knowledge that is held by a particular group of people. And it consists of a wide range of things, everything from traditions, norms of behavior, right to actual food, cuisine, and arts. So culture is very encompassing, but ultimately it offers us a framework to understand behavior and social conventions. And culture and how we relate to it is different for each of us. Culture is learned. And when I first started my study and work in this area, I was so fascinated by this concept. I had misconceptions about culture. I tended to think that culture only belonged to perhaps a diverse group of people, but I was wrong. All of us identify with culture. All of us have a culture that we are a part of, and culture is learned because culture is what teaches us how to think and often instructs us how to interact with others. So, for example, if you are from a high context culture or a low context culture, and I'm going to dive into those topics a lot in the next session, but I just want to touch on them right now. The way you interact and communicate with other people is vastly different. So, a high context culture is a culture where there's a strong reliance on nonverbal communication, and there's a shared understanding between the group when it comes to behavior and how to communicate. That's the opposite from a low context culture where we see a bigger emphasis on words and things are more clear and transparent, and it's more explicitly evolved around words, not evolved, sorry, but focused on words versus nonverbal practices. So, in those ways, cultures can teach us again how to interact with others. And it also influences our every thought, our feeling, and our action. Geography can affect how people conduct in a certain culture, but culture is much more than geography. We tend to think that culture is defined by a region or a land or geography, but that's not always the case. As we saw from our previous slide, there are a lot of elements that make up a culture. There are also various cultural differences. To begin with, there are differences in religion, there are generational differences within a culture, sexual orientation or how you identify in terms of gender is a cultural difference. There's educational differences, ethnicity. So there are a lot of different types of cultural differences that exist in our world and between each other. So again, one of those things that I had a myth about when it came to culture was that it was just confined to a certain region or a land or a particular group of people. But there are actually so many other elements that make up a culture, like we just discussed. And so do our differences. Our differences also make up our culture. And that's a good thing, that's a positive thing. I'd like for us now to reflect on our own interpretation, our own meaning of culture in our lives. And we're going to do an activity called the iceberg activity. And this is, as you may be familiar with the analogy of an iceberg, the analogy basically says that, like an iceberg, there's a lot of things that you can see visually by looking into the ocean. You see the top of the iceberg. So there's a lot of things that are visual to you. And then underneath the water, that's actually the biggest part of the iceberg. So there's lots that you're not seeing. When you look out into the ocean and you see that iceberg, you're actually only seeing the top of it. There's a lot that you're missing that's underneath the water that's not visible to the eye. Well, the same holds true of culture. So we're going to complete an activity and hopefully you can see this, but I am going to verbally walk you through it. But first, just to take a moment to process the information, I invite you to just read the description and then I'm going to walk us through the activity. Please have your notes app open or your notepad nearby. So as we just discussed, when we look at an iceberg, we just see what's showing above the water, and the rest, and often the biggest piece, is hidden below. And culture can be referred to in much the same way. When thinking about a culture that's different from yours, it might be easy to immediately recognize, well, that's different from what I view in my religion, or that's different from what my culture does. And we might even see simple differences, like we recognize there's a difference in food preferences. However, there are elements of culture that, again, are much deeper. And these deeper aspects have to do with the ideas that a culture has. And those ideas, again, are unique to each culture. And the challenge is that we often don't see those because we're just looking at the surface. We're just looking at the surface of a different culture than ours, and we're just usually just noticing the differences. And sometimes we don't go beyond that. Well, this exercise has us looking deeper into culture using that analogy of the iceberg. So, what I'd like you to do using your notes app or your notepad and pen is think about the characteristics of culture and how they fit into these three categories. So the first character are what elements of culture are easiest to see. So when you think of a culture different from yours, what are the aspects that you automatically know that are there? What are easier to see? And I'd like you to jot those down now. So if we look at our image of the iceberg, we are really talking about the most visual part of that iceberg or a person's culture that's different from ours. We're just seeing what's really visible to us. So take a moment to jot down what you think are the easiest aspects about a different culture that you can usually spot, they're easiest to see right away. So take a moment and write those down, and you can actually share what you've jotted down in the chat if you'd like. So you can share what you have for category A. So those are the elements that are easiest to see. Yes, Kelly and Donna, absolutely. Really good, Charlie. Yeah, personal space, excellent. Hairstyles, yeah, Victoria, exactly. Those kind of easy to spot things, right? That we see on the surface. Eye contact, housing, way of speaking, really good, everyone. Exactly. Gestures or greeting, that's another good one. These are the things that are immediately obvious to us. Food, language, yeah. So now working with our iceberg analogy again. So now if we're looking out into the sea, right, we see our iceberg and that's our metaphor for a different culture. All we're seeing so far is what's visible. So now let's go a little bit deeper. So we might shift our eyes towards the middle of the iceberg now. And this is category B. These are the things in a culture that really take some time to recognize. So these are not so obvious, they're not so visible. What are some examples of elements or characteristics in a different culture that take some time to learn about or recognize? You can write those down now on your notepad or in your notes app, or place them in the chat. Category B. Beliefs, values, the way they live. Excellent, Cheryl. Adam, education, really good point. Traditions, yeah, ethics, that's a good one. That's an interesting one. Traditions, yes, Carrie. Yeah, norms. So these are the things that really, they're not visible to us. We'd have to really take some time to recognize them. Rituals, excellent. Behaviors, yes, behaviors and norms. Struggles, yes, good insight there. I see that, Joanne. That's a good point. Different holidays, another really good point. Thank you, David. Yeah, so these are things that we'd have to really pause and think about, right? They're not automatically visual to us. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, our focus tends to be on what we see right in front of us, right? We just see the top of the iceberg, and that's what we're focused on. And very similar with a different culture, we're just sort of looking at what we visibly see and what's there to us on a superficial or visual level. And then category B are the things that we really need to take some time to think about and recognize. And then category C is when we finally look down and we look into the water or the seas and we realize, wow, there's a lot more of this piece of iceberg. And working with our metaphor still, wow, there's a lot more to this culture that I need to understand and that I want to understand. So list some examples from category C. These are things that are really associated and really only known to people of that culture. These are the deepest pieces and aspects. What do you think those could be? The why to who they are, Tanya, that's amazing. Collective experience, really well said, Andrea. Tina, history, yes, yes, history, good. So there is a difference between category B and C, right? B is like if you took a moment to learn, you might recognize some other aspects about the culture. C is the really deep pieces, the deep pieces that are only really known by members of that culture. What do you think those things would be? Those things that are only deeply known by members of that culture. Beliefs, exactly. Trauma, really good, Allie. Social economical conflicts, Kathleen, really good. Yeah, so we're starting to look deeper and think deeper now. Excellent examples, everyone. Politics, yeah. So isn't it amazing when we just take the time like we're doing now to go from thinking what's visible to us, what do I see, then thinking, okay, there are some things that if I took the time, I'd probably recognize. And then there's still this whole other level that's only deeply known to that culture. And for us who wants to engage and know more, that's really where our place is trying to connect so that we better understand that deep, deep layer. Thank you everyone for your participation. Your responses were so insightful. So how do we get there? How do we go to a place of when we are interacting and connecting with diverse peoples or people from a different culture? How do we move away from just focusing on what's visible to us, what we know to be there, and thinking more in terms of B? So can I learn a bit more? And then focusing on, well, if I really want that deeper connection and if I truly want to understand, I'm going to need to go deeper. I'm going to need to learn about the things that are really closely known by that culture. It doesn't mean that you will automatically understand that culture, but you are developing an understanding of how that culture is formed. And then in turn, you develop an empathy, an understanding, and an openness. And it's really only through that deep, deep part that we get to form those connective relationships. One of the ways we can do that, if you're wondering, well, how do I do that? Like, that seems really deep, Jennifer. It seems like how am I going to do that? I can't just walk up to someone and ask. Well, actually, by practicing principles of cultural safety, which include talking and engaging with people from that culture, you can form a deeper connection. The first thing is that we have to want this. We know that we are working with diverse peoples and groups and members all the time. And I think all of us as people have a deep need to connect, and this is one way we can do that. So the 5 principles are what you see on the screen and in the graph, which depicts a plant. And I'm going to go through each of them. So I'll have a slide devoted to each principle, so you don't need to worry about trying to read what's on the plant graph. But by practicing even just one of these 5 principles of cultural safety, you will become better prepared and connected to go deeper and to really start connecting with people from diverse populations and from different cultures. Let's look at the first one, which is protocols. And this is all about knowledge. Improve your knowledge. Find out about the cultural forms of engagement that people hold in their culture. Find out what the norms and traditions are. respect those, but gain knowledge of them first. And instead of just taking the easy way, and this is part of it, we open up Google and we look for some information or research on a culture, that's just the surface again, right? That's just the surface level. If we want to establish really deep, meaningful connections, then we want to talk with members of the culture to do this. And that means finding and building connections with allies of that culture or diverse population, developing communities of practice, or seeking out mentors in that culture. So I'd like to give an example of how we do this for each. And for this, I'm going to provide an example from my own experience. So when I first started working with Indigenous communities through my teaching and training, I really didn't know a whole lot, and a lot of what I knew was biased. So in addition to doing my own research, I really wanted to know more. I wanted to get deeper. I felt like if I was going to teach and learn, I needed to be there. So thankfully, with the help with Gardner Center, I did travel to Iqaluit and Cambridge Bay, and it was an incredible experience for me, because I got to go beyond what I was just researching or looking up and actually talk with learners from the communities, and that meant everything to me. It's what really shifted my perspective. So the first step is to go deeper, learn, but go deeper, talk and engage with members of the different cultures that you are interacting or working with. The second one is personal knowledge, and that's a big paragraph, so I'm going to give you a moment to read it first. So personal knowledge is really connected to another term, which is intersectionality. And that's something we're going to cover in the second series of the webinar. But really, it just means understanding your own identity, the socio-historical location of where you are, and how your location and how your own culture and identity has shaped your belief systems and led to certain advantages that you might have, or privileges, or even just experiences that someone from another culture may not share with you. And those things can include anything from health to child development or approaches to education. So understand where and how your perspective and identity has been shaped, and that's shaped by experiences and social factors, historical factors, and understand how they might be different from someone else. So just being aware of how your cultural identity has been formed. Number three is partnerships, and this is probably my personal favorite. Again, working with our iceberg, a lot of times we just stay at the surface level. We look at what is visible to us and we base our understanding on that. Now, we know that if we go to the middle of the iceberg, we're at least doing some research, or we're getting curious, and we're finding out some things that are more recognizable and deeper because we've done that bit of research. But if we want to get underneath the iceberg and really build those deep, connective, meaningful relationships, we've got to not only engage with members from that culture, talk, be with them, ask questions. We also want to form collaborative partnerships wherever we can. Look at challenges as this is a challenge that we're both going to jointly solve. Nothing is done in isolation. There's no hierarchy in problem solving. Everything is viewed as a partnership. So, for example, when I traveled to Cambridge Bay, I looked at this as this is shared learning. It's shared learning. It's a shared community. I might have PowerPoint slides, but that doesn't make me any different or more knowledgeable. We are sharing and building knowledge together. So form partnerships wherever you can and make them collaborative. Number 4 and 5 in the principles is process. And that just means engaging in mutual and continual learning. Just because, again, we've done some research and maybe asked a few questions, it doesn't make us experts on everything that's unique to that culture. As we've talked about, we always need to go deeper, and going deeper requires time. It isn't done in a one-off conversation. It's a continual process that happens and is sustained over long periods of time. And we make sure that we're always checking in to make sure that we're servicing people, right? And I love that term. We're servicing each other's needs. We're respecting each other's values. We're always making an opportunity for us to check in about different preferences that someone might have that's different from your preferences, making sure that we understand a behavior or a lifestyle choice, making sure not only do we understand, but that we're sharing in that, we're committed to learning. And the fifth is positive process. That means we're ensuring that we're always taking positive steps to service, and I love that word, to service the other person's needs. So if we are in a work environment and someone from a different culture might have a language barrier, for example, well, how can we help service that need better? We want to make sure that whatever we choose to do to address that is positive, and that again, the person is involved in that process. So that's number 4 and 5 of cultural safety, the 5 principles. And I want you to think about for a moment when it comes to all the elements. So I'll just put up our plant image again. When it comes to protocols, personal knowledge, process, partnerships, positive purpose, and this is what I'd like you to think about in closing, are what does all these principles mean when it comes to your workplace interactions? What are some challenges to applying these principles? For example, protocols. What are some strategies that leaders and colleagues can use to actively start promoting this principle? For example, personal knowledge. So for each of the 5 principles of personal safety, I'd like you to reflect on how we can apply this at work, how it shows up at work, and what strategies can we use to make these 5 principles more accessible in the workplace. So this is just my closing reflection to you. You can list your reflections in the chat. And if you notice, I'm just flicking the slides because I have each principle listed, but I have the same questions for each. How do you apply the principle of positive purpose? What are some challenges? And what are some strategies that we can start implementing now to apply process or to apply partnerships? I'd love to hear from you in the chat, and then we'll close the presentation part of the webinar. So responding in the chat, or jotting your reflections down on your notepad using your pen or in your notes app. How can we apply these principles, the 5 principles of cultural safety, in our workplace interactions? And what are some strategies we can come up with to start incorporating these principles into our workplace? What do you think? Yes, really good, Catherine. Open and safe spaces. I love that. And even having a designated safe space is often very important, especially if there's intergenerational trauma or there's a particular challenge faced. Good, excellent. With permission, good point, Michael, really good. Diversity on committees and boards, excellent. Yeah, so this is to get you thinking about how you can actively use this. And Rod, checking in to see how your communication exchange actually went, going back, right? And thinking, how can I do better? Always thinking about that iceberg. How can I go a bit deeper to really understand? Invite diverse peoples into conversations, confirm understanding, definitely. Education, really good responses, everyone. Yes, bias is a big piece of this, and we are going to talk about unconscious bias and those aspects in the third series. All right. I thank you so much for taking some time to reflect on how we can implement the 5 principles in your workplace. We're going to move now to the structured question and answer segment, which is going to run about 20 minutes roughly. And as Janet has from Alumni has already posted in the chat, you will put your question in the chat, and that can be found in the bottom right hand of your screen. And Allison talked about that at the beginning. It's in the bottom right hand of your screen, and make sure you click everyone when you type your question into the chat. So we're going to begin that now. I'm just going to stop sharing so that I can feel a sense of connection. I'm just going to stop sharing and we'll begin the question and answer now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Based on the engagement of people on the chat, it's obviously a topic that people are feeling passionate about, or, certainly they've expressed a lot of things that they're hoping to take away from today's session and the upcoming webinars. To get into the questions, one of the first ones is, how do you ensure that you do not burden marginalized people with the labor of teaching you about their culture, but in a way that still allows you to achieve, that principal number of creating cultural safety and awareness?
Yeah, what an amazing question. What an amazing thought-provoking question, and one that I think is really important to consider. So when we talk about building partnerships and going deeper and engaging with members of the diverse population or culture, that you're absolutely right. There has to be boundaries around that, because we don't want to make it the responsibility of the person in that group to be teaching and building awareness. Like that's not their responsibility. It's your responsibility to seek out knowledge and to do that in a way that is balanced. There are boundaries in place. I always like to favor of an approach of, you can ask if they might share some information on something that you learned in your research. So instead of this bombardment about, tell me, what you do in your culture, I want to learn more. And we're often, we're curious and we mean well, but as the person who typed the question, I apologize. What was the name, Allison, of the person who asked the question?
It has come in. I'm actually reading questions. I have somebody who's
Okay,
thinking of
sorry.
questions, so I
I
think it's
really
coming
wanted
to them
I really
individually.
wanted to,
Yeah.
that's okay. I always like to just make sure I acknowledge someone's name, but um, I think that, like what you said in your question, is absolutely accurate. We don't want to be burdening, and bombarding is another term that I use. So often, because we're curious and we want to learn, we will approach it like that. Like, can you tell me like about this, or can you share with me? But we don't need to do that. We know that we can do some research ourselves, and then maybe we can pick just one aspect that we might approach the person on, and just say, during my I did a little bit of reading because I'm really curious, and I'm so interested in you and us working more collaboratively together. And I noticed that you have this tradition. I just like to know more about it. So you're just picking one thing, usually that you gathered from your research, and you're focusing on that. Always have boundaries in place. We don't want to make it a responsibility of the other person. It's our responsibility. And then maintaining that deeper connection becomes a shared responsibility, where we're learning about each other.
And I think that's fair. And certainly I believe that, it is in our best interest to do some of that research as well, and then seek out that clarification, or, specific areas of interest, as you mentioned. Um, Another question is, how do we balance learning and understanding of other cultures, or perhaps highlighting, or convincing somebody the importance of it in what is right now a fairly polarizing climate, we'll say. How can I feel that some people are maybe a little bit tired of having to do that explanation and teaching. So what is a way that we can balance, as we've said, doing our own research, but also having them realize that we do wish or want to have their contribution to that conversation as well.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I understand the direct question because I'm getting two meanings from it. So, do you mean how do we still encourage people to do this extra learning and engagement, um, given the fact that it's a highly can be a highly like polarizing topic, and some people might be tired of this topic and even be afraid. Is that the question? How do we sort of keep encouraging people to still be thinking and talking about this?
Yes, it's a bit of a two part that we want to
Okay.
encourage people to keep doing that, but knowing that the other side of it may be that people are tired of
Yeah.
having to always be the teacher.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I mean, another amazing question. So, first of all, I guess belief systems and then the promotion of belief systems or values is probably a better word. When it's a lot, I guess, easier to do that at an individual level because you have certain values yourself as an individual. So I'll give you an example. So, as an educator, one of my values, no matter who I'm working with or how long I'm doing the piece of work for, there's a value that I have that it's like a shared learning experience. So then that value will come out in everything I do. So every slide that I design, every approach I take in the virtual or in class setting will reflect that value. So when we're operating from our own values, our behaviors reflect that, and it's a little bit easier. So if we believe in connecting and learning more about diversity and other cultures, that'll come out in our behaviors. We'll automatically be open, we'll be more curious, and we might share that with a colleague. But at an organizational level, if those values aren't embedded in the organization, can become harder. So an organization really it's more beneficial if the organization holds inclusivity and promoting inclusive communication, learning about diverse populations and peoples, if that's an organizational value, because values determine behavior and values can shape an organizational culture. So the organization, if it supports work in inclusive communication, that should be recognized in a value and then value shape behavior. So it's a shared, I guess, effort. I think it goes easier in the convincing or encouraging side. I think it's easier when it's an embedded practice or value of an organization to support inclusivity. I think it's easier to convince or encourage. If it's not, I think it's harder, but I also want to talk about how we cannot ultimately control or shape another person's behavior. We can only support and work from our own beliefs and hopefully practice it in how we model and show up in the world. I think a lot can happen if we are modeling and practicing the values we hold. I think you can get a lot further if the organization is doing that, modeling and practicing the behaviors around inclusive communication. I just think it becomes a lot easier to get that buy-in. In terms of fatigue, we live in a very polarized society. There are a lot of differing viewpoints on this. And we're also now receiving mixed messages at a global level about whether or not we should support principles like inclusivity. What I say to that is, I think when there's anything that involves, I guess, learning beyond what we're used to, there's always going to be a tiredness. We're always going to feel fatigued when we have to, for example, enhance how we communicate or learn something new or adapt. There's always a tiredness there that I think sometimes can get really amplified depending on what's going on around you externally or globally. Sometimes that fatigue gets really amplified. But I would say there's always tiredness there because we're learning something new and we're making an extra effort. And what I say to that is accept that there's a fatigue there. Remember, you don't have to learn everything at once. It's a lifelong commitment. And how does that commitment to inclusivity fit with your values? If you can make that connection at an individual level or an organizational level, it just gets easier to encourage others to buy in, and it gets easier for you to work through the fatigue that sometimes comes with engaging in a topic that is highly polarized.
Thanks. And I agree that it's certainly it's not something that we're expected to learn today, but this is certainly a first step to being able to take that and practice. So
Exactly.
in using the word practice, if you our next session is 2 weeks from now, if you could give people, perhaps a couple of practical tasks to do to try to incorporate some of the things that we have talked about today into their relationships and conversations before the next session. What are 2 or 3 small things that people could try to do to get, I guess, started on this practice?
Yeah, so I think it's just building on what I had asked you in our closing question, which is look at those 5 principles of cultural safety. Look at those 5 principles. These are widely used, they're widely researched and accepted. And so if you wanted to even find that image that's available, if you just do a bit of research on that. So if you can't remember all the principles, what I'm saying is definitely do a little bit of research. And then I invite you to pick just one, so just pick one and think about, well, how can that show up for me as an individual? So thinking at the really small level, because we know that if we tackle too many big changes at once, we have less of a guarantee of success. So we're just going to look at the 5 principles of cultural safety, refresh what they mean, and then pick one. And which one you pick should be based on the context that you're currently in. So for example, say there are 10 of you in an organization and you're all from different cultures, all 10 of you are from different cultures. Well, then which principle you pick might be more aligned to the context that you're in right now. So pick strategically, I guess. Pick which principle, pick it strategically based on your context. And then figure out how that might look like for you. And it doesn't need to be anything big. Maybe, for example, you are thinking through the lens of positive process for 1 week. And you're making a point of jotting down your reflections or things that you noticed in your behavior. So you're keeping a reflection journal all week. Maybe you're just observing how you tend to automatically focus on the surface level when it comes to engaging with different cultures. Take a note of that. It's almost like you're stepping onto a balcony and you're observing your behaviors as they relate to cultural safety. So logging what you notice as you try these principles or observing yourself and doing a little reflection journal is one strategy I can offer. The second one is to learn. I can't stress that enough. Choose a way that you want to learn that's aligned with category B of your iceberg. So that means you want to learn and do some research in a way that goes beyond just what you'd get if you typed it into Google or an AI companion, etc. How can you go a little bit deeper in your learning and your research? And what's that going to look like? Maybe it is having a conversation, but again, we want to be mindful of boundaries and not burdening. So maybe you take your research a little bit deeper. And that can be done as a self-study practice that you do and you commit to again for 1 week. So learn. Take a culture, maybe you're working with it now, pick one aspect and commit to doing a mini research project just for 1 week. So those are some 2 takeaway strategies. I definitely think starting with the 5 principles and picking one is a good way to start.
Okay, in the interest of time, I do have one last question that I think is really important to ask, and I hope that I doesn't have to be cut short, just so that we can conclude. But the question is, what happens if I make a mistake, or what do I do when I see someone else making a mistake when it comes to inclusivity?
So This is a really important question because it does involve another concept called allyship, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. So I'll start with part one. If you make a mistake, acknowledge your mistake. And a lot of people feel that they feel ashamed that they made the mistake, or they're afraid they're going to erupt a conflict, or maybe they don't want to admit it, so they'd rather hide it, and they feel that there's a vulnerability in admitting a mistake. But mistakes are honesty. Mistakes are saying, I did wrong here. This was, it doesn't matter about um how the other person, I mean, we don't know. We're never guaranteed for the other person to accept that or how they're going to respond, right? But acknowledge that it was a mistake. You've made a mistake. And the acknowledgement of that is taking ownership of that. And when you take ownership, then you pave the way for recovering from that mistake. So I can't stress enough about allowing yourself to be vulnerable, which means admitting this was wrong, I made a mistake. That vulnerability is actually what restores a connection or heals a connection. And it also reminds you, it reaffirms to you that you're committed. So acknowledge the mistake. And secondly, the second part to that is allyship is a very complex, multi-layered issue that I don't think is fair for me to cover in 10 seconds at the end. What I will say is that allyship is very powerful, it's very important, but it's very nuanced. And it's something that we can't just do with a click of our hands. Allyship involves a particular set of behaviors and practices. So I encourage you to read about allyship and think about, is that something that's reflective of your values? How can I be a better ally? And if that's what you feel will help you point out when you see mistakes of others, that's allyship. Allyship matters and it's important. I can't cover the full what that looks like in practice here, but I want to reaffirm that it's very, very important. So how you would correct is through allyship.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who submitted questions and for your engagement. And I certainly want to thank you for joining us today and for trusting us with your time. Jennifer, thank you, of course, for being the facilitator for this session as well. I hope everyone does leave today with some valuable insights and practical strategies for fostering meaningful change through inclusive communication. We see by our registration numbers that it's a topic that deeply resonates with individuals. And so we're so glad that you were able to be here and join us today. Again, we're going to have the second session happening in 2 weeks, Navigating Cross-Cultural Communication, on February 27th. And you will receive an email today with a follow-up link and a recording. So before we clue up, I would like to encourage you to stay connected with the Memorial's alumni engagement team as well as Gardner Center. And there are many ways to get involved and explore all that we offer. And for those that may not be aware, this is an exceptionally special and exciting year as Memorial celebrates its 100th anniversary. There is a very full calendar of exciting celebrations and events that are going to be happening. And we certainly hope that you will find time and opportunity to help us celebrate this milestone. And so if you want to, again, look at any of our web pages, you'll be able to see some of those events that are taking place. So once again, thank you for being here today. We're so glad that you were able to join us. Have a wonderful day. Take care and enjoy.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.